Iran has just seized a Chinese ship, and a bloody gamble with the U.S. Air Force? Ladies and gentlemen, a geopolitical chessboard full of covert calculations has just been flipped over by a bold move heavily reeking of gunpowder. While the world and two leading superpowers are shaking hands to arrange the global order, a shocking event has occurred in Middle Eastern waters, completely changing the landscape of the warfare. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran has just carried out a daring operation by approaching and seizing a floating mobile arsenal at sea. The noteworthy point is that the coordinates of the incident did not fall within the scope of the Strait of Hormuz, which is already all too familiar with clashes, but instead took place in international waters located approximately 38 nautical miles north of the United Arab Emirates and Port of Fujairah. This happens to be a vital, strategic oil-exporting port area and a core ally of the United States in the Persian Gulf. The targeted object was the ship A-10, a vessel flying a Honduran flag but operated by China. Field reports indicate that Iranian special forces boarded the deck, subdued the ship, and quickly towed it toward Iranian territorial waters. The appearance of a mobile arsenal bearing a Chinese element right in these waters, only to suddenly fall into Tehran and hands with such ease, has posed a massive strategic question mark for global military observers. Looking deep into its nature, this was not an ordinary oil tanker, passenger ship, or commercial cargo vessel. Nominally, the A-10 is a floating arsenal operated by a private maritime security company. Its mission is to provide weapons to commercial vessels traversing the strait for self-defense against piracy. Yet, ironically, this very arsenal meant to combat pirates was confiscated by Iranian armed forces without encountering any significant resistance. Analysts are raising major suspicions about whether there was an underlying covert coordination behind it, given that the ship and captain claimed to be completely blindsided by the attack. Notably, this seizure took place at the exact time the summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping was underway in Beijing. At the conference, the two leaders had just reached a mutual consensus that the Strait of Hormuz must be kept open to ensure the global energy flow, while asserting that Iran must never be allowed to possess nuclear weapons. Immediately after, Washington also declared that Beijing had committed to not supplying military equipment to Tehran. However, the actual actions at sea were like a bucket of cold water poured straight onto those flowery diplomatic statements. From the perspective of a geopolitical critic, this appears to be a sophisticated cicada shedding its skin charade. Beijing can publicly declare not to supply weapons to Iran, but a floating arsenal operated by them was suddenly and legally stolen right under the noses of the superpowers. This deceptive method of operation is not too unfamiliar in China and military doctrine, reminiscent of how they used to create military hardware with striking similarities to Western technology while always denying any direct connection. Reacting to this move, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued extremely ironclad statements. He asserted that Washington would never accept an exclusive Iranian control or toll collection system in the Strait of Hormuz, let alone accept their laying of naval mines in international waters. The message from the U.S. Department of State sent to Beijing this time was very clear and tough. America acknowledges the consensus at the diplomatic table, but does not need, nor does it depend on, China and help to maintain regional security. This shows that Washington is applying the strategy of keeping its enemies close, but keeping a potential ally with many hidden calculations like China even closer for easier surveillance. This event marks a serious new escalation in Iran and method of approaching and receiving weapons, pushing the conflict into a phase more unpredictable than ever. When the ink on the agreement documents between the two superpowers had not even had time to dry, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps created a fait accompli on the ground. This move immediately triggered military response scenarios from the U.S. side. Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Command, in a congressional hearing, testified under oath and outlined the steps that the U.S. military has been and is preparing to deal with similar coercive seizures. Currently, a U.S. naval task force has been deployed to the war zone, ready to suppress and neutralize the so-called mosquito fleet. Iran and Oppos's force of small, but highly disruptive fast attack craft specializing in conducting seizures of assets and weapons at sea. Developments over the past few dozen hours are pushing tensions in the Persian Gulf to a peak, as the parties are no longer stopping at deterrent statements, but have begun playing strategic cards aimed directly at changing the balance of power along the world and Oppos's vital maritime artery. On the Middle Eastern geopolitical chessboard, the seizure of the ship A-10 is exposing calculation-filled dark corners and strategic deception cards. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations quickly confirmed that this Honduran-flagged vessel was in fact a floating arsenal operated by China, carrying military hardware, ammunition, and defensive equipment for commercial ships. However, what makes observers skeptical is the mysterious disappearance of the elite security force on board at the decisive moment. Normally, a mobile arsenal equivalent in size to a large oil tanker like that should have been protected by maritime special forces teams at the highest level, equivalent to the U.S. Navy SEALs. The fact that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran easily approached and gained control of the ship without running into any resistance raises suspicions of an under-the-table arrangement scenario. Critics do not rule out the possibility that inside that cargo, there were not only conventional weapons, but it could also contain advanced electro-optical seeker systems used for surface-to-air or man-portable missiles, hardware capable of directly threatening U.S. fighter jets. Coincidentally, right during this time frame, a second ship in the waters near Oman was also attacked and reported to have sunk, pushing the atmosphere of the warfare to an incredibly tragic and heroic stage. In the face of rapid developments on the ground, the Iranian leadership has shown no signs of making concessions. On the contrary, they are ramping up their diplomatic rhetoric to its most extreme level since the war began. Speaker of the Iranian parliament Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who also serves as the chief negotiator in nuclear dialogues but is currently seen as being under heavy pressure from the Revolutionary Guard, issued an ironclad declaration that the country and Oppos's armed forces stand ready to teach an appropriate lesson to any act of aggression. Going even further, high-ranking officials in Tehran have repeatedly asserted absolute sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, while declaring they possess the right to seize any oil tanker with ties to the United States. To Iran, the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a maritime route, but is likened to a strategic nuclear weapon of sorts. Tehran and Oppos's tactic is to deploy a dispersed naval force, otherwise known as the mosquito fleet, featuring hundreds or even up to thousands of fast attack craft to harass and exert pressure on the global economy, forcing the international coalition to back down. They are prepared to bring down the world and Oppos's energy system if their position is threatened, in an effort to force the U.S. military to withdraw from the region. This escalation also reflects a profound stalemate on the diplomatic front, where peace agreements are proving to be futile. The ceasefire agreement signed on April 8th, mediated by Pakistan, now exists only on paper and is hanging on by a thread. Islamabad itself is caught in a tight spot and is suspected of compromise for allowing Iranian reconnaissance aircraft to station on its territory. The administration of President Donald Trump flatly rejected Iran and Oppos's latest response proposal relayed through Pakistan, calling it an unacceptable time-buying effort. Washington and Oppos's ultimate objective in these breathtaking negotiations is to force Iran to accept a clause freezing its uranium enrichment for 15 years. Currently, Tehran is believed to possess 440 kilograms of uranium enriched up to the 60% level, a dangerous threshold bordering on weapons-grade nuclear material. Conversely, the Iranian side only wants a 5-year freeze agreement as a stalling tactic, waiting for the right opportunity to perfect its nuclear technology under the protective umbrella of the Strait of Hormuz. Even though Iran repeatedly employs psychological warfare tactics and empty promises at the negotiating table to disrupt information, the U.S. military has shown it is by no means passive. Drawing upon Sun Tzu's classic military principle of knowing the enemy to win 100 battles, Washington is looking directly at Iran and Oppos's actual capabilities rather than exaggerated propaganda images. What transpired during Admiral Brad Cooper and Oppos's congressional hearing is clear evidence that U.S. Central Command has made precise calculations to counter and stand ready to crush Iran and Oppos's fast attack craft force. The appearance of the floating arsenal falling into Tehran and Oppos's hands will certainly increase weapon density on the battlefield and drive up risks, but it simultaneously triggers more drastic military countermeasures from the U.S. side to re-establish order in the Gulf region. Iran and Oppos's ultimate goal in this brain-straining gamble is crystal clear. They want to push the U.S. military out of the region, reject any substantive agreements, and continue using the Strait of Hormuz as the ultimate card to blackmail the entire world. To realize that ambition, Tehran relies on its fleet of fast attack craft armed with 12.7mm heavy machine guns, alongside anti-ship cruise missiles deployed along the coast or integrated onto larger vessels. However, the U.S. coalition, comprising the Air Force, Navy, and Army Apache helicopter forces, has already prepared a devastating counter-solution. In the skies over the Persian Gulf, the legendary A-10 Warthog tank killer has now been reborn with a new mission as a warship destroyer. Carrying a 30mm autocannon that vastly outperforms the 20mm ammunition of conventional fighter jets, this aircraft utilizes highly explosive incendiary armor-piercing rounds or ultra-sensitive fuses to turn Iran and Oppos's fast attack craft into burning debris. Dozens of A-10s have been deployed, ready to suppress the enemy and Oppos's somewhat rudimentary asymmetric warfare tactics. Not stopping there, the AC-130J Ghost Rider gunship, equipped with heavy firepower similar to a miniature howitzer, has also moved into position, creating a high-altitude protective fire net that promises to completely extinguish all wild ambitions of the Revolutionary Guard. The incident of the stolen floating arsenal was, in essence, merely a clumsy piece of theater directed from behind the scenes. The secure coordinates of the vessel A-10 appear to have been transmitted straight into the hands of Iranian special forces via encrypted communication applications, while the crew and security personnel intentionally pulled back to leave a vacuum for a smooth takeover. Beijing attempts to play the part of an utterly bewildered, innocent bystander, standing on the sidelines like a spectator completely oblivious to its own arsenal. But geopolitical observers understand that no coincidence is ever that perfect. Ordinarily, with the presence of the A-10 Thunderbolts in the sky, any such acts of piracy could have been intercepted and nipped in the bud by carpet-bombing runs of cannon fire. However, a sophisticated covert operation went through successfully, turning the seizure of the Chinese ship into a fait accompli. This move takes place against a volatile and tragic global backdrop, where on another front, the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv endured a devastating rain of missiles and drones from Russia on the very day of the U.S.-China summit in Beijing. That bloody assault left one person dead, dozens injured, and severely damaged 6 inner-city districts. This development unfolded just as the Council of Europe was finalizing procedures to establish a special tribunal to try war crimes related to the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin is deliberately ramping up the intensity of violence in an attempt to accumulate leverage and secure a dominant position at future negotiating tables instead of cooling down the conflict. Meanwhile, in the waters of Latin America, the United States Coast Guard, in coordination with Southern Command, just pulled off a breathtaking operation when the cutter Tahoma intercepted 3 self-propelled drug-smuggling semi-submersibles off the coast of Colombia. Because these vessels defied orders to stop, an elite sniper team operating from a helicopter delivered precise gunfire to completely disable their engines. This daring and high-risk operation successfully rescued and apprehended all 9 suspects, seizing over 6,000 pounds of cocaine, demonstrating the rapid and precise response capabilities of the U.S. military across global fronts. This daring and high-risk operation by the United States Coast Guard off the coast of Colombia concluded in victory, completely disabling the criminals and Oppos's vessels and resulting in the rescue and arrest of all 9 suspects. Authorities confiscated more than 6,000 pounds of cocaine with an estimated street value of up to $45 million. The success of this special operation is not only a heavy blow to international smuggling networks, but also opens up a deeper perspective for a comprehensive strategic analysis of what is unfolding in the Gulf, where a multidimensional geopolitical chessboard is being aggressively deployed by superpowers and regional forces. The true nature behind the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran suddenly seizing the mobile floating arsenal is the country and Oppos's severe shortage of military hardware. Under the pressure of economic encirclement and suffocating sanctions that cost Tehran up to $500 million a day, the Iranian economy is falling into chaos, and their military stockpiles have undoubtedly plummeted into a state of depletion. To maintain their combat strength, they are forced to seek additional sources of reinforcement. The arsenal they have just taken over, packed with assault rifles like the AK-47, RPG man-portable anti-tank weapons, and potentially even dangerous naval mines, is a timely lifeline to fill the weapon vacuum for Iran and Oppos's proxy naval forces. Clearly, there is a covert assistance from a major power standing behind to help Iran and Oppos's downsized fleet maintain its harassment capabilities. China has an enormous strategic interest in condoning the current chaos and instability in the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing absolutely does not want to see a scenario where the United States holds absolute control over this vital maritime route. For China, if a conflict breaks out in the Taiwan Strait in the future, they must ensure that the strategic oil flow from Iran to the mainland remains uninterrupted and blockaded by Washington and Oppos's hand. By escalating tensions on the ground through its fleet of fast attack craft, Iran is seeking to draw the United States to a negotiating table, but under completely absurd conditions that the U.S. side would never accept. This diplomatic tactic by Tehran is nothing short of a sophisticated multi-level marketing scam on the international stage. They attempt to approach Washington with the rhetoric that recognizing Iran and Oppos's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz is not merely a story about a maritime passage, but the foundation for a new order. They set conditions forcing the United States to accept a massive participation fee of up to $270 billion under the guise of war reparations, while simultaneously acknowledging Tehran and Oppos's absolute ownership of all resources in Iran, including the entire uranium reserves, and recognizing that the Strait of Hormuz belongs to them. In return, Iran paints an illusionary vision of a new global security architecture where all parties mutually benefit, while they merely play a modest role behind the scenes. This game of psychological warfare and energy blackmail is pushing the Strait of Hormuz into an incredibly fierce phase of warfare, where any miscalculations will be paid for in blood and the recession of the global economy. And in your opinion, was the seizure of the floating arsenal a surprise attack by Iran, or was it in fact an under-the-table handshake scenario arranged in advance? Will the terrifying firepower of U.S. aircraft like the A-10 Warthog be enough to deter Iran?